Flathead County, Montana. October 1946. Raymond Keller was 41 years old, a former CB engineer who'd spent 3 years in the Aleutians, building air bases on frozen rock. He'd seen Quonset huts hold up in winds that tore roofs off Quonsets, watched curved metal deflect weather that punched through wood. That autumn, while his neighbors were chinkling their log cabins and stacking cordwood, Raymond unbolted a war-surplus Quonset frame at the salvage yard in Kalispell and hauled it home on a flatbed. "You planning to store grain in that thing?" Jonas Millwright asked. Jonas was the valley's master builder, 63 years old, 35 years of cabins and barns behind him. He watched Raymond lay out the curved ribs in the yard. "That's not a house, Keller. That's a shed." Raymond didn't argue. He just kept working. The question wasn't whether it looked ridiculous. Everyone agreed it did. The question was whether Raymond had lost his mind in the war, and most of the valley figured he had. A metal shell over a log cabin. It made no sense. Jonas said it would sweat inside, rust through in 2 winters, collapse under snow load. The storekeeper at Foy's Lake said it was a waste of money. Raymond's wife, Helen, 38 years old, with 2 children, and a third on the way, asked him quietly if he was sure. "I'm sure," Raymond said. The problem wasn't the cabin. The cabin was solid, built in 1938, chinked tight, with a fieldstone chimney and a cast-iron stove. The problem was the wind. Flathead County sits at the edge of the Rockies, where the plains meet the mountains. And when winter storms come off the peaks, they don't slow down. 40, 50, 60 miles per hour. Sustained. The wind finds every crack, every gap, every place where chinking has shrunk or logs have settled. It pulls heat out through convection faster than a stove can replace it. Raymond had watched it happen every winter. Mornings at -10, -15, the cabin would be warm. By evening, with the wind screaming, it would be 45 degrees inside with the stove roaring. Helen would bundle the children in wool blankets. They'd all sleep in the same bed, huddled, and every morning, Raymond would split more wood. He'd used 4 cords the winter before. 4 cords, and they were still cold. Raymond Keller wasn't guessing. He'd learned underground in the Aleutians, where engineers built insulated structures to survive 100-mile-per-hour winds and sub-zero cold. The principle was simple. You don't fight the wind. You deflect it. You create a dead air barrier between the wind and the structure. Still air is one of the best insulators on Earth. Moving air is one of the worst. The Quonset shell would take the wind. The air gap between the metal and the logs would trap still air. The cabin inside would stay calm. Jonas didn't buy it. Air don't keep you warm, Keller. You're building a sweatbox. That metal's gonna drip condensation all winter. You'll have ice on the inside walls. Raymond kept working. By mid-November, the shell was complete. Curved corrugated metal, 16 feet wide, 24 feet long, covering the cabin like a half-cylinder. Raymond left a 6-inch gap between the metal and the logs on all sides. He vented the air gap at the peak, so moisture could escape. He sealed the base with packed straw and a timber sill to keep wind from blowing up through the gap. The cabin door opened into a small enclosed vestibule he'd framed at one end of the shell. It looked like a grain silo. The valley called it the tin coffin. Jonas came by in late November, shook his head. "You've got maybe a month before that whole thing rusts through, or the snow crushes it. Metal ain't meant for roofs, Keller. Raymond's oldest child, Margaret, 9 years old, asked him one evening, "Papa, why does ours look different?" "Because different isn't always wrong," Raymond said. Helen Keller was a practical woman. She'd grown up in a sod house in eastern Montana. Knew cold, knew hardship. She didn't argue with Raymond's ideas, but she watched. That first week of December, with the stove burning steady, she noticed the cabin felt different. Quieter. The wind would howl outside, rattle the metal shell, but inside the cabin the air was still. No drafts. No cold spots by the windows. "It's holding," she said one evening. Raymond nodded. The neighbors were less impressed. At the trading post, men joked about it. "Keller's living in a can," someone said. "Probably cooks himself when the sun hits it." Jonas told anyone who'd listen that the whole thing would fail when the real cold came. "Wait till January," Jonas said. "That's when you find out if a structure works." Raymond's military service had been quiet work. 3 years in the Aleutians, building infrastructure on islands where the weather was worse than Montana and the supply lines were longer. He'd learned to build fast, build smart, and build for wind. The Quonset hut design had been tested in the worst conditions on Earth. Corrugated metal, curved to shed wind and snow. Simple. Proven. He didn't talk about the war much, but Helen noticed he worked with a precision that wasn't there before. Every measurement exact, every joint sealed, every detail thought through. "You've done this before," she said one afternoon, watching him caulk the vestibule frame. "Something like it," Raymond said. By late December, the valley was into it. -5, -10 at night. Neighbors were burning through their woodpiles faster than expected. The wind was relentless, coming off the peaks in gusts that shook walls and found every gap. In the traditional cabins, families huddled close to stoves, wore coats indoors, slept under piles of blankets. Raymond's family wore sweaters. The difference was the air gap. The wind hit the metal shell, screamed around it, but couldn't penetrate. The still air between the metal and the logs acted as insulation. The cabin inside stayed calm. The stove's heat wasn't being pulled out by convection. It stayed in the structure. Helen noticed they were using less wood. A lot less. "Are you sure the stove's burning right?" she asked one evening. Raymond checked it. "It's fine. We just don't need as much." Jonas Millwright had built 43 structures in Flathead County. Cabins, barns, a church, 2 schoolhouses. He knew wood, knew chinking, knew how to make a cabin tight. But he'd never seen anything like Raymond's setup, and he didn't trust it. "That metal's gonna conduct cold straight through," Jonas said at Foy's Lake in late December. "And when the snow load hits, those ribs are gonna buckle." "Maybe," someone said. "But Keller's not burning much wood." Jonas frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean his wood pile ain't going down. Mine's half gone already." Jonas didn't respond. But the next day, he rode out to Raymond's place. The Keller family's daily rhythm was different that winter. In past years, Raymond would wake at 5, stoke the stove, add wood, wait for the cabin to warm enough for the children to get up. This winter, the cabin was still warm from the night before. The stove had coals. He'd add a few pieces of wood, and within 15 minutes the space was comfortable. Margaret and her younger brother, Thomas, 7 years old, didn't wear coats inside anymore. They'd sit at the table in sweaters, do their lessons, play quietly while Helen worked. In the evenings, they'd all gather near the stove, but it wasn't desperate. It was comfortable. Helen, pregnant and tired, noticed she wasn't cold all the time. That alone was worth everything. Then January showed up. January 19th, 1947. The temperature dropped to -18 overnight. By morning, it was -21 with a wind out of the northwest at 50 miles per hour. Wind chill put it near -50. The kind of cold that kills livestock, freezes pipes, stops engines. In the valley, families woke to ice on the inside of their windows. Stoves that had burned all night were struggling. Wood piles that had seemed adequate in December were suddenly inadequate. People started rationing, burning furniture, consolidating families into single rooms. Raymond woke, checked the stove. Still warm. The cabin was holding at 65 degrees. The storm lasted 3 days. -21 the first night, -24 the second, -26 the third. Wind sustained at 40 to 60 miles per hour. Snowdrifts 6 feet high. The valley was locked in. In Jonas Millwright's cabin, 2 miles south, the temperature inside dropped to 42 degrees with the stove going full. He and his wife wore coats, slept in layers, burned wood constantly. On the second day, Jonas started burning chair legs. At the Hendricks place, a quarter-mile from Raymond's, they moved everyone into the kitchen and sealed off the rest of the house. The stove ran day and night. They burned through a week's worth of wood in 3 days. Raymond's family stayed in the main room, comfortable. The stove burned steady, but not hard. The air gap was doing its job. The metal shell took the wind. The still air insulated. The cabin inside was calm. By the third morning, Raymond had used maybe 1/10 of the wood his neighbors had burned. When the storm broke on January 22nd, the valley emerged cautious. Drifts everywhere. Roads impassable. But the wind had stopped, and the temperature had climbed to -5. People started digging out, checking on neighbors, assessing damage. Jonas Millwright rode out on horseback to check on families. He stopped at the Hendricks place first. They were alive, exhausted, almost out of wood. He helped them dig a path to their woodshed. Then, he rode up to Raymond's. The Quonset shell was intact. Snow had drifted around it, but the curved roof had shed the load. No buckling, no damage. Smoke rose steady from the chimney, not the desperate black smoke of a stove running wide open, but the thin gray smoke of a controlled fire. Jonas dismounted, knocked. Raymond opened the door. Warm air poured out. Jonas stepped into the vestibule, then into the cabin. It was warm. Not just bearable. Warm. 68 degrees. Maybe. The children were at the table in sweaters. Helen was working at the counter. The stove was burning, but low. Jonas stood there, silent. Raymond didn't say anything. He just waited. "How cold did it get in here?" Jonas finally asked. "Didn't measure exactly," Raymond said. "But we never went below 60. Jonas looked at the walls, looked at the ceiling, looked at the metal shell visible through the window. "How much wood did you burn?" "Maybe 1/4 of what I usually do." Jonas walked to the window, ran his hand along the log wall. It was dry. No condensation. No frost. He looked up at the ceiling. No dripping. The air gap had vented moisture out the top, just like Raymond said it would. "The metal doesn't sweat?" Jonas asked. "Condensation forms on the outside of the metal, not the inside. And what little moisture gets into the air gap vents out at the peak." Jonas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I was wrong." Word spread fast in a small valley. By the end of January, 5 families had visited Raymond's place to see the Quonset shell for themselves. Some were skeptical. Some were desperate. All of them noticed the warmth. Raymond walked them through it. The metal deflects wind. The air gap insulates. The cabin inside stays calm. Simple physics. No magic. "How much did it cost?" someone asked. $120 for the surplus Quonset frame. Maybe another $30 in hardware and lumber for the vestibule. And it works. It works. By March, 2 families in the valley had started building their own metal shell structures. One used salvaged barn siding. Another found surplus corrugated panels at the rail yard in Whitefish. Jonas Millwright helped with both, applying what he'd learned from Raymond's design. "You measure the air gap carefully," Jonas explained to the first family. 6 inches minimum. You vent the top so moisture escapes. You seal the bottom so wind doesn't blow through. And you make sure the metal is far enough from the cabin that they don't touch. The structures went up in weeks. By the following winter, both families reported the same results. Warmer cabins, less wood, no condensation problems. Raymond's innovation wasn't complicated. It was just smart. The Quonset hut had been designed by the Navy for exactly this kind of problem. Harsh weather, high winds, rapid deployment. The curved metal shed wind and snow. The air gap provided insulation. The whole system worked because it was simple. But it required thinking differently. It required trusting that still air could insulate better than thick logs alone. It required accepting that a metal shell, something that looked industrial and ugly, could make a home warmer. Most people in 1946 couldn't make that leap. Raymond could, because he'd seen it work in the Aleutians. The Keller family lived in that cabin for another 12 years. Every winter, the Quonset shell performed exactly as Raymond had built it to perform. The metal didn't rust through. The snow didn't crush it. The air gap didn't fail. In 1959, Raymond sold the property and moved to Kalispell to be closer to his aging parents. The new owner kept the cabin and the shell for 3 more years, then tore the whole thing down to build a modern house with electric heat and insulation. The Quonset frame was hauled to a ranch and repurposed as a machine shed. It's still there, as far as anyone knows. Jonas Millwright built 7 more metal shell structures between 1947 and 1954. He adapted the design each time, some with vertical siding, some with angled roofs, some with double air gaps. But the principle stayed the same: deflect the wind, trap still air, keep the cabin calm. In 1952, Jonas wrote Raymond a letter. "I thought you were crazy," he wrote. "Turns out I was the one who didn't understand. Thank you for showing me." Raymond kept the letter. He didn't frame it or show it off. He just kept it. The principle Raymond used wasn't new. It was basic thermodynamics. Still air insulates, moving air conducts. Wind pulls heat away through convection. Block the wind, you keep the heat. But applying that principle in 1946 Montana, in a way that looked ugly and made people uncomfortable, took something most people didn't have. It took confidence in the physics and disregard for the ridicule. Raymond had both. Helen Keller, in a letter to her sister in 1953, wrote, "That first winter in the metal cabin, I thought Raymond had built us a tomb. By the end of it, I knew he'd built us a home. We were warm when everyone else was freezing. The children didn't get sick. We didn't burn through our savings buying extra wood. It was the smartest thing he ever did." The letter is in a family archive somewhere. Nobody reads it now. By the late 1950s, most of the metal shell cabins in Flathead County were gone. Families upgraded to modern houses with central heating and proper insulation. The war surplus dried up. New construction used different methods. But for a decade, in one small valley in Montana, a handful of families stayed warm, using a technique that everyone had called crazy. They stayed warm because one man understood wind and still air, and the difference between the two. The math was simple. A traditional log cabin in Flathead County, in a January storm, with wind at 50 miles per hour, would lose heat through convection at a rate that required constant stoking. The cabin would stabilize at maybe 40 to 50 degrees inside, with the stove running full. Raymond's cabin, with the metal shell and air gap, blocked the wind entirely. The logs inside were insulated by still air. The cabin stabilized at 65 to 68 degrees with the stove running low. Temperature differential, roughly 20 to 25 degrees warmer. Fuel savings, approximately 70 to 75% less wood. Cost, $150, one time. It worked because it was simple. What Raymond built in 1946 wasn't revolutionary. It was adaptive. He took a proven military design, applied it to a homestead problem, and solved it. The innovation wasn't the Quonset hut. The innovation was recognizing that the principle could work in a different context. That's what most frontier innovation was. Taking what worked somewhere else and making it work here. Raymond didn't invent the air gap. He didn't invent the Quonset hut. He just put them together. In 1961, a graduate student from the University of Montana drove through Flathead County documenting old homesteads. He photographed Raymond's original cabin. The Quonset shell was still intact, though the cabin inside had been stripped. The student's notes read, "Unusual hybrid structure. Metal shell over log construction. Appears sound. Purpose unclear." He didn't understand what he was looking at. By 1965, the Quonset frame had been moved to a ranch and converted to equipment storage. The logs from Raymond's cabin were salvaged for firewood. The site was cleared and sold. Nobody in the valley remembered why the metal shell had been built. The families who'd copied the design had moved on or upgraded. The knowledge faded. Within 20 years, it was forgotten entirely. Raymond Keller died in 1983 in Kalispell at 78 years old. His obituary mentioned his military service and his work as a carpenter. It didn't mention the Quonset cabin. His daughter Margaret, by then in her 40s, remembered the winter of 1947. She remembered being warm when everyone else was cold. She remembered her father building something that everyone mocked, and then being proven right. "He never said I told you so," she say. The Keller cabin stood as proof for 12 winters. 12 winters where the metal shell deflected wind, where the air gap held still and insulated, where the family inside burned a fraction of the wood their neighbors used. But proof doesn't always translate to adoption, and adoption doesn't always translate to memory. By the early 1950s, the valley was changing. Rural electrification reached Flathead County in 1951. Families who'd relied on wood heat for generations suddenly had options. Electric baseboards, oil furnaces, propane heaters, the old methods, chinked logs, fieldstone chimneys, careful fire management, started to feel like hardship rather than necessity. Raymond watched it happen. He didn't fight it. Progress was progress. But he also noticed something. The families who switched to electric heat didn't understand thermal mass anymore. They didn't understand air gaps or wind deflection, or why still air mattered. They just flipped a switch and expected warmth. It works until it doesn't, Raymond said one evening in 1952, reading about a power outage that had left 3 counties dark for 2 days in February. Then what do they do? Helen looked up from her mending. They figure it out. People always do. Maybe, Raymond said, but they won't know why it works. They'll just know that it does. That was the shift. In one generation, the knowledge moved from understanding to operation. People stopped asking why cabins stayed warm and started asking whether the heater was on. The Hendricks family, a quarter-mile south, installed electric heat in 1953. They kept their wood stove as backup, but they rarely used it. The first winter, their electric bill was $60 a month. The second winter, $75. By 1955, they were paying $90 a month to stay warm. Raymond's heating cost, firewood he cut himself, maybe $20 in saw maintenance and fuel per winter. But the Hendricks had convenience. They had thermostats. They had rooms that warmed evenly without tending a fire. And in 1955, convenience mattered more than cost. Jonas Millwright felt the shift too. By 1954, nobody was asking him to build log cabins anymore. They wanted frame houses with drywall and insulation bats and modern windows. They wanted structures that looked like they belonged in a magazine, not on a frontier. I built 47 cabins in this county, Jonas said to Raymond in the spring of 1955. I don't think I'll build another one. Raymond nodded. Times change. They do, Jonas said. But that doesn't mean the old ways were wrong. No, Raymond agreed. Just means they're old. The 7 metal shell cabins Jonas had built between 1947 and 1954 all survived into the 1960s. 2 were torn down for modern construction. 3 were converted to storage sheds. 1 was abandoned. 1 burned in a kitchen fire that had nothing to do with the heating system. Only Raymond's original Quonset cabin remained occupied through the end of the 1950s, and even that was sold when Raymond moved to Kalispell. The knowledge didn't die suddenly. It faded. Families who'd used the metal shell design moved away or passed on. Children who'd grown up warm in those cabins moved to cities where central heating was standard. The few people who remembered the innovation remembered it as a curiosity, not a solution. By 1965, if you'd asked someone in Flathead County about the Quonset cabins, they might have remembered them. They might have said, "Oh yeah, those weird metal things." Did those actually work? And if you'd asked how they worked, most people wouldn't have been able to tell you. In 1968, a state historian compiling records of homestead construction in Montana interviewed 12 longtime residents of Flathead County. Not one of them mentioned the metal shell cabins. The technique had lasted 20 years, kept dozens of families warm, saved thousands of dollars in fuel costs, and within 2 decades, it was invisible to history. That's how most frontier innovation disappears. Not with drama, not with failure, just with time and changing priorities. Raymond himself didn't talk about it much. When people asked about his time in Montana, he'd mention the valley, the winters, the community. Occasionally he'd mention the Quonset cabin. But he didn't frame it as innovation or survival wisdom. He framed it as common sense. Wind was the problem, he'd say. So I stopped the wind. That's all it was. His grandchildren, born in the 1960s and 70s, grew up hearing stories about Montana winters, but the details were vague. They knew their grandfather had built something unusual. They knew it had worked. But they didn't know the physics. They didn't know the measurements. They didn't know how to replicate it. Knowledge that isn't written down, that isn't taught formally, that lives only in the memory of the people who used it. That knowledge is fragile. One generation forgets to pass it on, and it's gone. Margaret Keller, Raymond's oldest daughter, moved to Seattle in 1958. She became a school teacher, married, had 3 children of her own. She lived in a house with central heating and never thought much about firewood or air gaps or wind deflection. But in 1974, during the oil crisis, when heating costs spiked and people started talking about energy efficiency, she remembered that winter in 1947. She remembered being warm when everyone else was cold. She remembered her father saying, "Still air insulates." She wrote him a letter. "Do you remember the Quonset cabin? Could something like that work now?" Raymond wrote back, "It could, but nobody wants to live in something that looks like that anymore. They want insulation you can't see. They want walls that look normal. The principle's the same. Trap still air, block the wind. But the execution is different now. Foam insulation, vapor barriers, double pane windows. It's all doing the same thing we did, just with different materials." Margaret kept the letter. She didn't do anything with it, but she kept it. That's the closest the Quonset cabin innovation came to being preserved. One letter, kept in a drawer, read occasionally, but never shared. In 1979, an energy efficiency researcher at Montana State University published a paper on historic homestead heating methods. He included a section on earth-sheltered construction, another on thermal mass stoves, another on wool insulation. He did not mention metal shell air gap construction because he'd never heard of it. The technique wasn't secret. It wasn't suppressed. It was just forgotten. By 1980, all 7 of the metal shell cabins Jonas had built were gone, torn down, converted, or collapsed from neglect. Raymond's original Quonset frame survived only because it had been repurposed as a machine shed, and even then nobody remembered its original use. If you'd driven past that ranch in 1980 and seen the curved metal structure, you'd have thought, old equipment shed. You wouldn't have thought, innovative survival shelter that kept a family warm at 75% less fuel cost during one of the coldest winters in Montana history. Context disappears faster than structures do. Raymond Keller died in 1983. His funeral was attended by family and a few old friends from the valley. Jonas Millwright had died 2 years earlier. Helen had passed in 1977. The generation that had built the Quonset cabins, that had understood why they worked, that had lived through the winter of 1947, that generation was ending. Margaret spoke at her father's funeral. She mentioned his military service, his carpentry work, his quiet determination. She mentioned the cabin briefly. "He built something everyone thought was crazy," she said, "and it kept us warm." She didn't explain how. She didn't explain why. There wasn't time, and it didn't seem important. After the funeral, one of Raymond's grandchildren asked Margaret, "What was that about a cabin?" Margaret tried to explain. The Quonset frame, the air gap, the wind deflection. But she didn't remember all the details. She remembered being warm. She remembered the metal shell. She remembered the skeptics. But she couldn't explain the physics clearly enough for it to make sense. "It was something he learned in the war," she said finally. "And it worked. That's all I really know." The grandchild nodded and moved on to other topics. That conversation, in a church basement in Kalispell in 1983, was probably the last time anyone in the Keller family discussed the Quonset cabin as a functional innovation. After that, it became family lore. A story, something Grandpa did once that was unusual and clever, but not particularly relevant. In 1992, Margaret's daughter was researching family history for a school project. She asked her mother about Raymond's time in Montana. "He built a cabin with a metal shell over it," Margaret said. "It was warmer than the other cabins." "Why?" her daughter asked. Margaret paused. "I'm not sure I remember exactly. Something about wind and air." She wished she'd asked her father more questions. She wished she'd written down the details. But she hadn't. And now, it was too late. The knowledge was gone. In 2008, a renewable energy enthusiast in Whitefish, Montana, 30 miles from where Raymond's cabin had stood, published a blog post about passive heating techniques. He discussed thermal mass, earth sheltering, and double wall construction. He mentioned that some old homesteaders had used air gaps between walls for insulation. He didn't mention the Quonset cabins. He didn't know they'd existed. But the principle he was describing was the same principle Raymond had used 60 years earlier. Trap still air. Block the wind. Let physics do the work. The knowledge hadn't disappeared entirely. It had just been rediscovered, renamed, and repackaged as something new. That's the pattern with forgotten frontier innovation. The techniques don't vanish forever. They get reinvented. But the context, the specific stories, the specific people, the specific winters that proved the techniques worked, that context is lost. Raymond Keller proved that a war-surplus Quonset frame and a 6-inch air gap could keep a family warm at 75% less fuel cost in one of the harshest climates in Montana. That's a fact. That happened. But if you search for Quonset cabin air gap heating Montana 1940s, you'll find nothing. No articles. No records. No documentation. The technique worked. It saved families. It spread through a community. And then it disappeared from memory. That's not unusual. That's standard. Most of what people knew about survival on the American frontier, the specific techniques, the specific adaptations, the specific innovations that kept families alive. Most of that knowledge was never written down. It was passed along informally, used for a generation or two, and then forgotten when conditions changed. We remember the big innovations, the steel plow, the windmill, the barbed wire. We remember those because they were commercialized, patented, sold widely. But the small innovations, the ones individual families developed to solve specific problems in specific places, those are mostly gone. Raymond's Quonset cabin is one of thousands of examples, probably tens of thousands. Techniques that worked, that saved lives, that could still be useful today, but that exist now only as faint traces in family stories or forgotten paragraphs in local histories. This story survives because someone happened to remember it, because Margaret kept her father's letter, because a detail was preserved just barely long enough to be reconstructed. But for every story like this one, there are dozens that weren't preserved. Innovations that worked just as well, maybe better, but that disappeared completely because nobody wrote them down. The lesson isn't that we should romanticize the past or try to live like homesteaders. The lesson is simpler. Good ideas are fragile. If you don't preserve them, they vanish. Raymond Keller understood wind and still air. He applied that understanding in a specific way, in a specific place, at a specific time. And it worked. That knowledge, that still air insulates, that wind strips heat, that a simple air gap can make the difference between comfort and suffering. That knowledge is permanent. Physics doesn't change, but the story of how one man applied that knowledge, and how it saved his family, and how it spread through a community, and then faded from memory. That story is just one of thousands that barely survived. Hold on to the stories. Write them down. Pass them on. Because winter doesn't care what you've forgotten. The end.